Funding for this video was provided by the Scholars Strategy Network.
My name is Tanya Rhodes Smith, and I am the director of the Nancy A. Humphreys Institute for Political Social Work at the University of Connecticut School of Social Work. In this video, we are going to give you a brief overview of voting rights in the United States. We will cover who can vote in our country and how the fight for this fundamental right continues today. You can find more information about this and more on our website, votingisocialwork.org.
Let's start by talking about who is eligible to vote. In the United States, roughly 255 million people are eligible to vote in our elections. You can vote in U.S. federal, state, and local elections if you are a U.S. citizen, meet your state's residency requirements, and are 18 years old on or before Election Day. States have different rules about the process of voting, so you should always check with your local election office for the rules where you live. For example, in almost every state, you can register to vote before you turn 18 if you'll be 18 by Election Day. Some states, however, allow 17-year-olds who will be 18 by Election Day to vote in their primaries. In most places, you have to register to vote in order to cast a ballot, but in North Dakota, there's no required voter registration, and in about half of the states, you can register and vote right on Election Day. Some states, however, require registration as early as 30 days before an election.
There are many groups of people that we may assume aren't eligible to vote, but in fact can and should be supported to vote. For example, you can be experiencing homelessness and still be eligible to vote. Americans with disabilities are entitled to a full and equal opportunity to vote. All people with disabilities are eligible to vote unless a court issues a specific order preventing them from voting. Accommodations provided by each state vary in how they interpret and implement the guidelines. Find resources and links on our website. Active duty members of the U.S. military, their families, and U.S. residents living overseas have the right to vote by absentee ballot. Individuals incarcerated awaiting trial who have not been convicted of a crime can vote. Most states have address confidentiality programs to allow individuals who have experienced domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, and other crimes to vote safely. Some states also allow other populations, such as people who provide reproductive health care or members of law enforcement, to participate in such programs.
The vote is the pillar of democracy, but it was not easy to get here. Rather, since the 1900s, if not before, major social movements have played key roles in securing voting rights and resisting those who fought to reverse their gains. Indeed, the hard-won victories of the suffrage, labor, and civil rights movements increased access to the ballot for women, workers, and voters of color. However, the expansion of voting rights threatened white supremacy, male privilege, and class power, and immediately came under attack by white landowning men seeking to maintain the status quo. The most notable and violent backlash followed the Civil War, when during Reconstruction, the people elected more than 2,000 black men to local positions, all the way up to the U.S. Senate. Threatened by this newfound political, social, and economic power, whites launched a century-long era of Jim Crow, poll taxes, literary tests, intimidation, violence, and other tactics intended to keep the vote and the power that comes with it out of the hands of persons of color. The victories of the Civil Rights Movement, especially the landmark Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the election of the first black president, sparked the more recent backlash. Evoking the earlier poll taxes, today voter suppression, election deniers, efforts to overturn election results, and gerrymandering represent a few of the tactics designed to silence the voice and limit the power of voters of color. Our history reveals, and recent events repeat, what marginalized groups, especially those subject to government-sanctioned disenfranchisement, have always known. We cannot take the right to vote or democracy itself for granted.
The Voting Rights Act of 1965 ended many of the tactics used to suppress the political power of non-white voters. However, felony disenfranchisement remained legal and expanded in the era of law and order, including the war on drugs. Beginning in the early 1970s, which contributed to making America the world's largest incarcerator and stripping millions of their right to vote, sometimes for life. More than 20 million people in our country have a felony conviction, and going into the 2024 election, more than 4 million are disenfranchised. These rules are set at the state level and can be very complicated. In 38 states, rights are restored either after incarceration, parole, or probation ends. 10 states include processes for restoring the right to vote, including waiting periods, payment of fines, or specific actions like requesting a pardon. In only 2 states, Maine, Vermont, and now in Washington, D.C., individuals convicted of a felony never lose the right to vote. This wide variation has led to widespread misinformation, with most people believing that someone with a felony in their past cannot vote. This has had a lasting impact on the political power of communities most impacted by the criminal justice system. As of 2022, an estimated 4.4 million Americans, disproportionately those who are Black and brown with a felony conviction, were ineligible to vote. Millions more have the right to vote but are not able to access it.
The fight for voting rights and access continues today. Over the last 20 years, many conservative state legislatures have put barriers in front of the ballot box, imposing strict voter ID laws, cutting voting times, purging voting rolls, limiting polling locations, and restricting registration. These efforts received a boost when the Supreme Court weakened the Voting Rights Act significantly in 2013 in its ruling in the Shelby County versus Holder case. In her dissent in that case, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg said that throwing out preclearance when it has worked and is continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you are not getting wet.
Gerrymandering is the process of drawing districts to benefit the political party in power. This has created districts across the country where the outcome of the general election feels predetermined and voting feels less important. Citizens in some states, like California and Arizona, have pushed back on this practice, and now they have nonpartisan commissions that create districts. But in most states, the party in power draws voting districts, and they have many incentives to do that in ways that keep them in power.
In addition to losing the voice of voters of color, younger voters may get left behind as well. Many youth experience uneven and unequal civic education, receive less campaign outreach than older adults, and face logistical barriers when they try to vote. Accessing absentee ballots in many states is a very challenging process, which can particularly affect college students. In recent years, misinformation and disinformation claims about voter fraud and the very integrity of U.S. elections after the 2020 election eroded trust and is thought to connect with low voter turnout. Experts expect disinformation campaigns to continue to get more sophisticated and specific in attempts to target specific groups of voters, particularly those in communities of color.
Structural barriers to voting don't just make voting more difficult, they feed a narrative and the myth that voting doesn't matter. The reality is that democracy at every level of government reflects the priorities of those who participate in elections. When turnout is low, it gives those who do vote, often folks who are older, whiter, and wealthier, outsized power and influence over decisions made in their communities.
Voting rights are human rights, and social workers are perfectly positioned to support our democracy. We can join the fight to expand voting rights and access in our states, work to end all forms of disenfranchisement, serve as election volunteers and poll workers, and ensure that every individual has the information, support, and encouragement they need to exercise their right to vote. You can find more information at our website, votingisocialwork.org.